Well, howdy y'all, this is Randy, aka Banjo Randy, and I'm a totally blind woodworker getting back into my woodworking. When I say totally blind, I mean I have no physical eyesight anymore. And you also notice that I'm wearing glasses. Well, in my normal daily routine, I don't even wear glasses. This is an old pair of prescription glasses I used to wear when I could see, but I only wear them now to protect my eyes, and plus I wear a full face shield. But I thought since this is a woodworking video, I would go ahead and wear them, like I did in my other videos. But like I say, this is a toy box that I built for my great nephew. It's made out of 3/4 inch Luan plywood. I trimmed everything out with solid red oak. And I'm going to try to explain how I did this, and hopefully I won't confuse y'all too much. Because I have to stop and think about how I did this, because when I'm downstairs working, all this is just second nature to me. I don't even think about it then, I just do it. Excuse me. But the first thing, this toy box from the floor to the very top of the lid is 24 inches. Now the total length of the toy box, minus the lid, is 36 inches long. It is 18 inches deep, or wide rather, and it's, without the lid, it's 23 1/4 inches tall. So, one of the first things I done was I laid some 2x4s, 4 of them down on the basement floor, and I took this sheet of plywood and laid it down on there. And I made the first cross cut at 35 inches. That would make the pieces for the front and the back panel. So I put that aside, and I flipped the plywood end for end. And I made another cross cut at 37 inches. That became the lid and the bottom of the cabinet. And the piece that was left over, that is what I made the sides out of. So I put the piece for the top and bottom and the sides aside for a minute. Then I got the first piece that I cross cut at 35 inches. And then I took that and I rough cut it to 23 inches. I made one rip cut, and that broke that piece into 2 more pieces, easier for me to manage. And then the side piece, I was going to cut it down a little bit with my circular saw, but I was having trouble with it, which turned out to not really be any trouble at all. It was the motor housing was hitting the clamp that I used on my straight edge, and I didn't realize it at the time. But when I later used the circular saw, I realized that's what happened. But anyway, I took the front and back pieces, and then the piece that I was going to use for the side panels, I took this to the table saw. Now, I trimmed the top and bottom edges of the front and back and the side pieces with 1/2 inch thick solid oak that I ripped on the table saw. So the first cut that I made on the table saw was for 22 1/2 inches. So I took the factory edge of the front and back piece and I put that to the rip fence. Then I made one nice clean cut on the front and back panel, set that aside, and then I did the same thing with the piece left over that I made the sides out of, putting the factory edge to the fence and then cutting one piece and taking the other piece, flipping it over, and then making another cut, and that gave me the side panels, at least for the total height, Yeah. And then after that, I then took and set my rip fence to 22 1/4 inches. Again, the total height is going to be, without the lid, 23 1/4 inches, but since I'm using 1/2 inch thick oak to trim it out, that means I have to take 1 inch off the total height, which is 22 1/4. That was my final rip. And then I put the freshly cut ripped edge to the fence, and then I ripped the front and back and both sides to the correct height then. After I'd done that, I then took this piece that I used for the sides and I made a cross cut, and I believe I did that at 17 inches, just to slightly have it oversized, as far as the width goes, or the width. After that was done, I then took a piece of 1x4x8 red oak, and I cut a piece 35 inches long. And then on my table saw, I ripped 6 pieces, 1/2 inch thick. And I used 1 piece or 2 pieces, one for the top and one for the bottom of the front panel and the back panel. Then the 2 pieces left over, I just cut them in half, and that gave me the 2 pieces for the top and bottom of the side panels as well. So once I did that, I then took and I glued the 1/2 inch strips to all 4 pieces, making sure that when I glued this up that I left the solid oak slightly proud of both faces at the top and bottom on all 4 pieces. And then once I had those all clamped up, left them overnight, and then the next morning I took them out of the clamps because I used glue only on this. I didn't use any mechanical fasteners. And then what I did next is I took and I put a flush trim bit in my router and I trimmed the faces, the solid oak flush to both faces on all 4 pieces. Once that was done, then I worked on the length of the front and back panel. Now, like I said, the toy box is 36 inches long. However, I wrapped it in 3/4 inch thick red oak on the corners and on the back edge as well. So that means that I had to take an additional 1.5 inches off the length of the front and back panel. So that would be 34.5 inches. However, the joinery I used to join the sides to the front and back panels is known as a lock rabbet joint. Excuse me. So what I did was I allowed myself an additional 1/8 of an inch, and that way I would have a 1/16 of an inch proud of both faces on the front panel when I glued it up to the sides, that I could flush trim and have a nice flat corner here. I didn't have to worry about trying to line nothing up. That's one reason why I like to use like a lock rabbet joint, because it's self-aligning for one thing, and I don't have to worry about trying to make sure that the edges are all flush, because it basically, it's a given, because you got that dado that the rabbet goes in. So, but anyway, after that, like I say, I cut the front and back panels to length, which is 34 5/8 inches. Now the side panels, I determined that they had to be 16.5 inches, because the box without the front corner trim on it was going to be 17.25 inches. So that means that the side panel, it had to be 16.5 inches, and that includes the 3/8 on each end for the rabbet joint. So next I then took and put a 3/8 inch straight bit in my router, and I put on the edge guide. And on a scrap piece of plywood, I made a 3 inch deep by 3/8 inch wide groove. And this is just a witness mark, so that when I made the rabbets, I would know exactly how thick to make the rabbet so it would fit into that groove, or actually dado on the front and back panels. So I then took and put my rabbeting bit in my router table, and then with another test piece, I set the bit height, I believe, to about 3/16 of an inch, and I made the first initial pass on one face only, on what would be the inside, or actually the outside face, because you have to put the face side down, the good face side down on the router table. So once I did that, I then slowly started raising the rabbeting bit up, and with the test piece, I finally got it to where it would fit into the groove that I made snugly, not too tight, not too loose, but just snug. So then I took and I run the side pieces on one face, on both edges, on both of those pieces. Next, I then took my router with that 3/8 inch rabbeting, or 3/8 inch straight bit, and then I made another test piece, and I fixed it so that when I run that groove, or the dado actually, I would have about a 1/16 of an inch once I put the side panel into the front. Like I say, that gives me enough to trim off after the box is all glued up, so that I would have a nice flush corner here. So after that was done, I determined what was going to be the inside piece of the front and back. And so then I took and I made two passes. I made one pass at about 3/16 of an inch deep, and I run one face, both ends of both pieces. And then I reset the bit depth to 3/8 of an inch, and I run these pieces again. Now after that was done, I then took an undersized router bit made just for 3/4 inch plywood, because plywood runs a little undersized. It's not a true, at least none of it that I've used in a long time has been a true 3/4 of an inch thick. I think it usually runs about 23, 30 seconds or something like that. But anyway, I determined, well actually, I already know what the inside piece was going to be on the front and back because of the Dago joint. I just had to remember to keep the groove for the plywood bottom on the same side as the Dago, the 3/8 inch Dago for the front and back panels. And then of course the side panel, I had to remember that the full face was the inside. The part that had the rabbet, the little cutout part, that was going to be on the outside face. So once I figured that out, I made this 1 inch up from the bottom is how I set the groove. And I set it and made two different passes. I made a pass at about 3/16 of an inch deep, and I run all four pieces, like I say, on the inside face. And then I reset the bit depth to 3/8 of an inch, and I rerun the pieces again. After that was done, I then took and I sanded all the inside faces of the front and back and the side panels. And I also then took the piece that I was going to use for the bottom, and I sanded the inside face of that as well. So the first thing I done was I glued this up in two different steps. I glued the back panel, I laid it down on my bench, and then I made sure that the groove for the plywood was on the same end. And that once I did that, I then put glue on the, well actually let me back up. I also, on the front and back panels, I took and I made 4 holes so that whenever I put the side panel in there, I could use screws to hold it while the glue dried. So after I'd done that right there, I then laid it down on the workbench, the back panel, and then I put glue in the Dago, and then I put glue on the rabbet, making sure again, like I say, that the groove matched on each end. And then I put that in place, clamped it up, making sure that the faces were all even on the top and bottom of the faces. Once I clamped it, I then put 4 screws in there, and they were countersunk as well. Now I also took and made what I call some squaring blocks. When I had each end on there, I had made these right here. These grooves, I'm going to call them grooves, even though a groove generally goes with the grain, they say, and the Dago goes against the grain. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to say groove. These grooves are 90 degrees to each other, and I've made this on a scrap piece of plywood with that same undersized plywood bit. And I left it to where it was 3/4 of an inch from the edge, because plywood can be pretty fragile on the edges right there if you get it too thin. So after I'd done that, I took and cut a little notch out so that when I put this on the piece, after I had it glued up, if there was any glue at all that I missed somehow, it wouldn't get stuck, on the blocks on the corners. So once I glued the first 2 together, I then took, the next morning, then sized the bottom, figured out how wide of course it had to be basically the same width as the sides are, which was 16.5 inches. Excuse me, and I cut it to the correct length. And I was going to glue this in, the bottom end, on all 4 sides, but once I dropped the bottom end to the groove, it wasn't hardly no getting it back out. It was a nice snug fit, so I just left it in there. And then I took the front panel, and then I put glue in the gate on, also on the ends of the rabbets, on the side panels. And then I run a bead of glue on the inside, on the front panel on the groove. And I also put a little bit on the edge of the plywood as well. And then I put these pieces together. Then I secured them with clamps and then secured them with the screws. And even though I used those corner blocks, I still checked it and it was nice and square. So once this was done, the next day, I then took and put my flush trim bit back inside my trim router, and I flush trimmed the edges of the front and back pieces to the side, so I had some nice square corners right here when I put the corner pieces on. Excuse me. So after that, I then began to work on my corner pieces. Again, this is made using 3/4 red oak, and I used a 1x4, 8 foot long, and I took and I cut 4 pieces. And I believe I cut these about, I believe it was 23.5 inches. And I used the same lock rabbet joint to join the side to the faces right here. Excuse me. The other thing is I only use glue alone and clamps. I didn't use any screws to fasten this together to the side, right to the. When I say the side, I mean the side of the trim pieces, the oak. And also I left the front edge right here just slightly proud of the face of the side piece right here, so that when it dried overnight, I took again and I flush trimmed this edge right here flush. And I also left these pieces at full width to start with. And I forgot to mention that I jointed these edges before I run the rabbet and the groove to join these pieces together as well. But after all that was done, I then took it to the table saw and I cut it just slightly over 3 inches on the face and on the sides, and also on the side piece here. And once that was done, I then took the front corners and I jointed each edge of that. And I already had one side of this nice, and actually both pieces of this were joined. So I didn't bother once I trimmed the side piece to 3 inches or slightly over. I didn't join the back edge of it because I left it proud as well whenever I glued this on there and flush trimmed it to the back as well. But anyway, once I had these front corner pieces, the edge flush trim, I then took a 3/8 inch round and cut to the correct width. I then took a 3/8 inch round over bit in my router table, and on the front corners, I rounded over all 3 of the outside faces right here. Now on the back pieces, I only rounded over one edge, and that was the face side that was toward the front of the toy box. The back side I didn't round it over with the 3/8 round over bit. So after I done this, I then took the pieces and each one, and I carefully fitted them to each corner and each back piece. Now I also joined, when I put these front pieces on and the side pieces right here, I used glue and screws. The screws was only temporary just to hold it while the glue dried. So I drilled 5 holes centered on each face, on each corner and the side pieces. I don't know if y'all can see that or not, but there's 5 dowels that I put in here. And I used 1 1/4 inch pocket hole screws to secure this with the glue and clamps to start with. And then once I put the screws in there, I took the clamps off. The screws were just to hold the corner pieces and the side piece to the carcass or the toy box long enough for the glue to dry and set and everything. Actually, I left them in there 2 or 3 days. I mean, they wasn't hurting nothing. But when I drove these screws in, I set the clutch on my drill so that I wouldn't overdrive them. And the reason I use pocket hole screws is because they have washer heads on them. And I didn't want the bugle head of a screw, regular drywall screw, because if you drive it in too tight, it leaves that little indentation in there, and I didn't want that. So after I put these screws in, I then took a regular hand screwdriver and just made sure they were nice and snug. Once these pieces right here were on, I then concentrated on the top. Now, as I said, this top right here, it overlaps the front and the sides by 1 inch. So that means that the total width of the lid without the trim had to be 18¼ inches, and the length had to be 36½ inches. Excuse me. Now I joined the edges of the solid oak to the top by a tongue and groove joint. Now I was going to use, to start with, a 1/4 inch slot cutting bit, but that didn't work out because when I set it up, I didn't realize it, but the collet nut stuck up just barely past the router base. So when I made a test cut on the scrap piece, it literally made a little notch on top, just like you made, like it would be like an undercutter, like on the raised panel or something. And if I had just thought and slid that router bit out about another 1/8 inch, I could have used it, but I didn't think about it at the time. So what I wound up doing is I put a 1/4 inch straight cutting router bit in my router, and I put my edge guide. It was already on there. So what I done was I had to route these pieces on edge. And I did this in 2 passes. I made the first pass at 3/16 of an inch deep. And like I say, I set the bit distance from the edge of the bit to the edge guide 3/16 of an inch. So I made 1 pass on all 3 sides on one face, turned it around, and made a second pass on the other face on all 3 sides. That way it centered the groove in here on the edge of the plywood. So after that, I set the bit to 3/8 of an inch deep, and then I did the same thing. I run it on edge on one face on 3 sides, turned it around, and repeated the process. And again, that left me a 3/8 inch deep groove that was centered on the edge of the plywood. Now the trim pieces, they wound up being 1 1/8 inches wide. So what I did was I took another piece of the 1x4, and I believe I cut that to, I believe it was 40 inches long. And then I took on each edge, and I used the rabbiting bit again in my router table, and I run each edge, flipped it over, run the other edge, then turned it on the other edge, and then run both sides of that until I got the tongue to where it was just a slit fit inside the groove there. Once that was done, I then took and I cut one piece basically in half, and that left first thing I done was I ripped it on the table saw 1 inch and 1/8, and then I took and I cut one piece in half, and that gave me one end of each edge of the plywood right here on the ends. And then I took the piece that I cut for the end, I put a miter on each end, and I did that for a reason. I made like a witness, what I call a witness miter. So I did this to the other piece as well, and I used that one side piece and brought the other side piece up together to where the miters met. And then I marked it and cut the first piece to length. And then with that end piece that was cut off with the miter, I simply, again, I put the pieces to where they met right here, and I clamped the witness piece in place so it wouldn't move. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. On each edge, I drilled 4 holes, and I secured each end piece of the trim with screws. And I believe I wound up drilling 7 holes across the front right here. and I did the same thing with it, secured it with glue and screws. But anyway, getting back to the miter corners here, I used that witness block and clamped it. That way, I would know for sure that the miters are going to line up at the end, because when you can't see, you have to do different things to make sure that the miters meet, that you won't have no gaps and stuff in it. But once I done that, I then took and I put glue in the groove and on the edges of the tongue of the side piece. And I clamped one of them in place first, secured it with screws, and I did the opposite end. Again, I used this little witness block here at the opposite end, and I did the same thing. Now on the front piece, I cut one end at a 45 degree, and then I marked it. I like to use an actual nail set that I have. I like to use that over my scribing, my marking guide. But I cut that oversized, and it took several cuts before I got it down to the right length. Because one thing I didn't want to do is cut it too short, so I made several light passes until I got it to where it fit nice and tight, the corners. Now before I glued this last piece on, I took and smeared a little bit of glue just on the end grain of the miters on all four edges. And I let that set for about 10 to 12 minutes. And then I did the same thing again. I smeared a little bit of glue just on the miter joint only on all four of the miters, and let that set, for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then I put glue in the groove and on the trim piece. And then I put that in there, clamped it up, and then I secured it with the screws. And I like to do that using a little bit of glue first on these miters, because end grain soaks up a lot of glue and stuff, so this would kind of give it a little heads up. I just think it makes for a tighter fitting corner. That's just how I feel about it. But anyway, the next day what I did was I took the screws out, and again I took my flush trim bit and I trimmed the faces on, the edges on both faces flush to the top and the underside of the lid. Excuse me. Then I filled these holes in with some dowel stock. And what I used to fill the holes in right here was I had a whole bunch of these fluted 1/4-inch dowel pins, and that's what I used. I had to re-drill the holes, because the holes I drilled to start with to put the screws through, they were 3/16, and these right here are 1/4 inch. So I used a handheld drill block. If I can find it here. Let's see. Right here. There it is. And that's what I used to drill to re-drill all 30 of these holes. But first I took and put a piece of tape on the face, and then I punched each hole through with that nail set that I have as a quick reference point. And then I took my 1/4-inch bit, and I don't have any decent stop collars, so what I done was I used a 1/2 inch, and I believe a 3/8 and a 5/16, and I slid them under the drill bit and put the drill bit through here, and that left about 1 inch of the drill bit exposed, and that was just right, what I wanted. So I then re-drilled all 30 of these holes. After that, I took and stood the box up on one end, and I took and put some glue in all 10 of these holes on the outside first. And then I took and put some glue in a container, and each one of these dowel pins, I stuck it down in there and smeared glue all on it really good. And of course, I set it in the hole, all 10 of them, and then I took my hammer and drove them until they bottomed out. So and then I wiped off any excess. That's why I put the tape on there, because I tend to be kind of messy when I glue, because like I say, I can't see what I'm doing. I'm having to do everything by feel. But after I wiped off any excess, I then did the front side the same way. Then I tipped it up on the opposite end and did the opposite end, the last 10 screw holes. After that dried overnight, I then took a flush trim saw and cut all the pieces off, and I removed the tape. after that, I then took and I fitted and I put a 3/8 inch round over on each corner right here. And then I took a 1/4 inch round over and rounded over all the top and bottom edges of the lid. And I forgot to mention, I also put a piece about a 1/4 inch strip on the very back here as well. So after I got all that done, I did put the piano hinge on there. And this lid does, I think, close a little fast probably. So I'm going to research and try to find a little bit better lid supports on here, soft close lid supports. I first started with the left and right, and it just, the 45-50 torque rating was just too stiff. You literally had to close it completely by hand. So I reordered 2 more at 35 to 40 pound torque rating. And they were just too weak then. And when I ordered the 35-40 torque ratings, I also ordered 1 single back mount at 35-40 pound torque rating and 1 45 to 50 pound torque rating. Well, the 45-50 is what I wound up using. And like I say, it probably is just a little quick, but this is basically what I used on my other toy boxes and cedar chests and stuff I built years ago as well. But after I got all the hardware and everything on there, I then took the hinge back off and the lid support here, and then I then took and put a 1/8 inch router bit in my trim router, and I routed the top edge on the inside and outside edges, and I also did on the bottom edge on the underside as well, so there won't be no sharp corners or nothing. After all that was done, I then began my final sanding, which I first, well, I forgot to mention that before I put the corner pieces and the side pieces on, I also took and sanded with 180, and I also sanded with 180 on the inside before I glued the box up, because it was much easier that way. Sorry about that, y'all. I kind of got ahead of myself there on that, but anyway, after I sanded the outside with that 180, that's whenever I put the corner pieces and everything on. Then I hand sanded with 220 on everything then. But the top, I went ahead and just used my orbital sander with 220 and did my final sanding. Now, the finish I used on this right here, I used a satin water-based polyurethane. And to start with, I took on the underside and I put about 3 coats on the very bottom of it and the bottom edges. I like to do that. That way it seals everything up from moisture. At least it helps, in my opinion. After that, the next day, I then took the inside and I put 3 coats of water-based polyurethane on the bottom and the inside and the underside of the lid. And then the next day, after all that, I then wound up putting 4 coats just on the outside and the top of the lid, and 4 coats on the back of the lid. Every 2 coats, I did a light sanding with 220 and wiped everything down real good, put the last 2 coats on. But I wound up putting 6 coats on the top and 6 coats on the side and the front. And like I say, 4 coats is all I put on the back. That was plenty. Excuse me. But the final sanding I did with 400 grit, and then I applied 2 coats of mid-wax paste wax to it. And this is the results right here. And I certainly hope that I didn't confuse y'all in trying to explain how I did this. But like I say, y'all, this is second nature to me when I'm downstairs working. I don't even think about it then. But anyway, I certainly hope that this was a blessing to somebody. And I just want to say to anybody out there that might be listening to this video, if you have a disability, never ever give up on your hopes and dreams, because there are things that we can do, people with disabilities. Just like you see here, there's people that sighted that never would believe that a totally blind person can do this kind of work. But I've done this before back when I had some useful sight. So I'm no stranger to woodworking and all, and joinery and different things like that. Now, I do have a disability. I am totally blind. However, I do not consider myself disabled. But again, like I say, I hope that this video was a blessing. You know, I didn't confuse y'all too bad. And to all of us who do woodworking, let's keep making sawdust. Be safe in our shop. You know, wear all the proper safety equipment, you know, safety glasses, hearing protection. Just always be alert and aware of your surroundings when you're in the shop working. And I certainly hope that everybody has a wonderful and blessed day. And as always, everyone keep smiling. And y'all folks have a good one. Blessings.
Take picture. Button. Stop recording video. Button.